Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are waiting for our live streamers to join, and you can view this via Zoom. If you've registered, you can also view this broadcast through the City of Little Rock's Facebook page. We should be streaming live now. View this broadcast. We are streaming live now. Okay. So thank you all for joining. If you are joining us through Facebook, please like and share this stream. We are really excited to share this information. This project has been a labor of love for not only the city, but the members of the Independent Review Committee that have worked tirelessly to get this information together, and to our contractors. And so we are really excited about presenting this information, and we're really excited about the citizens of Little Rock hearing this information. So please share this podcast with your friends in your networks. I'll give you just a second to do that. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Ferronda Brassfield. I am a local attorney. I'm also a member of the Little Rock Independent Review Committee. To give you some background on our committee, early last year, in accordance with his ACT plan, which is accountable, clear, and transparent, Mayor Frank Scott Jr. initiated an independent third-party review of the entire Little Rock Police Department's policies, practices, and procedures to determine what, if any, corrective actions needed to be taken to improve the Little Rock Police Department. The objective of this review was to ensure compliance with best practices in policy, procedure, and protocol, and it was carried out by officers in the department leadership, and the Independent Review Committee. I want to introduce the members of our Independent Review Committee, some amazing people that care so much about justice in our city and beyond, and many of whom have spent their careers working towards justice and equity. Our first member is Lieutenant Benny F. Bowers. He is a retired Michigan State police officer, and now he is in Arkansas, and we are claiming him as our own. Archie Bird, who is a partner at Mays, Bird and Associates, a phenomenal attorney with years of experience. Paula Casey, she's a former dean of our law school, and she's a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District. John DePippa, Dean DePippa, he is a Dean Emeritus for the University of Arkansas at Little Rock Bowen School of Law, and just a phenomenal constitutional attorney and thinker. We also had the phenomenal Tamika Edwards, and everyone knows Tamika. She is always working to improve our city and our state. She's currently working as the special advisor to the Central Arkansas Water CEO on diversity, equity, inclusion, and engagement. And Tamika was the head of our committee, and she helped to rein us in and to keep us all together. And so we thank you for your commitment to this project, Tamika. Michelle Kamerling, who is a partner at Wright Lindsay Jennings, another phenomenal attorney here in the city of Little Rock. Philip Kaplan, many of you may know him as Phil Kaplan. He's an attorney at Cross, Gunner, Witherspoon, and Gouches, and he was also another phenomenal attorney on our committee. And our last committee member, last but not least, was Dr. Terry Trevino Richard, who is a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Our committee worked in collaboration with the firm to review the Little Rock Police Department and the City of Little Rock's policies to identify specific issues needing further evaluation, to interview necessary partners, to determine the appropriate scope of this particular review, and to set the parameters for the research analysis and recommendations for the firm. We met a number of times in the thick of the pandemic, talk about commitment. We met to talk to people. We talked to the chief of police. We talked to the city attorney. We gathered information. We met and broke up into subgroups to kind of break down what we could find and what we saw as the issues that needed to be determined by our contractors. And we were able to through the RFP process, find amazing contractors in the form of CNA. And I'd like to introduce CNA and the staff that's with us tonight. We have Tom Kristoff, who is a senior research scientist with CNA, and also Ben Carlton, who is a senior research specialist with CNA. And I'd love to pass the torch and pass the mic so that you can tell the public more about the research that you found and what your findings were for this study.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Fernanda. As stated, my name is Tom Kristoff. I'm a senior research scientist with CNA. I'm joined here with by Ben Carlton, who also works with us on and worked on this assessment with me. I've got a presentation that we'll go through, but I do want to say from the start that this has been a wonderful experience getting to know the City of Little Rock's Police Department, getting to know the community members of Little Rock, and being able to have this collaborative and being able to have this discussion tonight. So I very much want to just state my appreciation. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and we'll make sure that all the technology is good. And I just can others see this? Perfect. So alongside with Ben, there's a couple other people who had worked on this presentation with us. T. Bowman, who is a former police chief, as well as Chip Cauldron, who's also with CNA. Kind of giving some background of CNA, we're a nonprofit research and analysis corporation, and the center that we work for, the Center for Justice Research and Innovation, we've assisted over 450 law enforcement agencies nationwide doing reviews of their policies, trainings, operations, providing technical assistance. We're also national leaders in law enforcement, providing, like I said, technical assistance. And I don't want to harp on the background of the company for too long, but one thing that I really do want to emphasize here is the independence of CNA. From the beginning, we want to make sure that we are independent, that we're looking at the policies, that we're looking at the training and operations through an unbiased eye and through an independent eye, and making sure that the findings and the recommendations that we're coming through are based on our experience. So kind of why we did what we did. We had a number of goals and objectives with the audit that we performed. We wanted to look at policies and procedures. We wanted to make sure that those policies and procedures, that they reflected national best practices. Not only those policies and procedures, but we wanted to look how those topics of interest are integrated into training, as well as how well that training is consistent with adult learning approaches. We then looked at accountability system data to make sure that the operational part of it reflects a fair and impartial process. And from our review, what we wanted to do was be able to provide actionable recommendations for reform. And you'll see in the report, we had a number of findings and a number of recommendations. But overall, we wanted to see not only was the Little Rock Police Department, did they have these policies and training, but how well these policies and trainings address the topics of interest. We had a number of different areas of focus, 15 of them, and you can see them all here, where we had started off with, I believe it was just the first 10 that was in our scope of work, but through communication with this committee and receiving feedback, we added a couple of other areas of focus that we wanted to look at, including the early intervention system, body-worn cameras, vehicle pursuits, asset forfeiture, and take-home vehicles. So we have done this presentation. We did this presentation prior, and we received feedback about areas where we could either expand our assessment or include other areas of review into our assessment. So I'll go into, kind of the methodology that we used. We looked at a number of different documents, including policies, like I said, training. We looked at state laws. We took all of that stuff and we reviewed them, we analyzed them, and we came up with findings and recommendations. Those findings and recommendations are also influenced by a number of focus groups that we had with Little Rock Police Department officers, as well as targeted interviews with particular Little Rock Police Department areas, such as the training division. And so we took all of those and we created our observations and our findings. I won't go through each one of these. It's just kind of a list of all of the things that we did look at. And so you can see we had an expansive number of things that we looked at. A little bit about the focus groups that we did. We talked with representatives from each patrol division. We had 3 officer focus groups. We had 1 sergeant focus group, and we talked with them about their perspectives, their concerns, their suggestions regarding policies, training, and overall operations, as well as the targeted interviews that I had previously spoke about. So I'm going to go in through a little bit of our findings and recommendations. I'll highlight some that are relevant, but I also do refer you to the full report to see all of the findings and recommendations. But these are some select ones that we found kind of fell into some overarching categories and some broader themes. The report is in 7 sections. Like I said before, we had several findings. We had over 80 findings, and each one of our findings had between 1 and 4 associated recommendations. So going into some of the key findings with the accountability system, one of our main findings was that there's a lot of discretion that lies with the chief. The chief has discretion on where an administrative investigation might go, which is a concern that we had, where it shouldn't be the chief. In policy, it should say, if it's this type of complaint, it should be investigated by this role. The Little Rock Police Department has supervisory investigations, but it was the chief who was deciding where it went. Did it go to a supervisory investigation, which could lead to formal discipline, or does it go to, does it go to a full IA investigation, which could lead to formal discipline, or does it go to the supervisory investigations, which are oftentimes for lower level complaints? So again, just the overall discretion that's being held by the chief, it allows for potential inappropriate intervention. A couple of things with the data. We had found that community member demographics, particularly race and gender, are not reliably captured in the data. Of particular note is Hispanic community members, where I believe there were 6 in the course of the 5 years of data that we had looked at. There were a total of 6 Hispanic community members captured in the data. And this has to do with the way that demographic data is coded. And so we've got the recommendations to better capture that data, and as well as investigations that are department initiated, that demographic data is rarely captured. We had also found that officers perceived inconsistencies in the initiation, the investigation, and the disposition of administrative investigations, and they often pointed to cronyism or favoritism. And this, I think, what we had recommended was that the department better capture and gather those perceptions, because I feel like the department wasn't really listening to the officers, that these perceptions were very real, but they often felt like management didn't listen to them. And finally, with the data, we had found that the police department doesn't adequately categorize allegations of misconduct by type, severity, or origin. And again, that just helps the department have a better understanding of what the data is trying to tell them. And with the way that they capture it, they just don't have that understanding, or can't have that understanding. So one of our main findings was a consistent trend of disparate outcomes for non-white female personnel. And what I mean by disparate outcomes is you often had more allegations per complaint. So a complaint can have several allegations. And when we looked at it, non-white females often had 1.56 allegations per complaint, as opposed to white males who had 1.35 allegations. And these differences are statistically significant. Similarly, the number of days to complete the investigation, non-white females, the investigations took 68.7 days, whereas for white males, it took 57.5. And when you're talking about an investigation, you don't want the investigative cloud hanging over somebody's head. And when you've got the investigation open for longer, it leads, there's just no resolution. And so that's why you want to close it as quickly as possible without jeopardizing the integrity of the investigation, obviously. Similarly, with sustained rate, non-white females had a sustained rate of over 50%, whereas when you looked at white male sustained rate, it was 29.3. So we recommended that the department more fully explore those disparate outcomes. I'm going to hand it over to Ben Carlton, because he had done some of this work on performance evaluations, as well as a couple of the next couple of topical areas. So I will hand it over to Ben.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. So as Tom said, as part of this audit, we also looked at LRPD's performance evaluation process. And so to do this, we reviewed LRPD's General Order 205 and also conducted focus groups with LRPD officers, both patrol and supervisors. And so ultimately what we found is that performance evaluations within LRPD are not conducted in a consistent manner across officers, and that performance evaluations have very little, if any, impact for an employee's professional development. And so this leads to the process not being taken seriously by officers and supervisors alike. In terms of the little significance that the performance evaluations have in Little Rock Police Department, we found that performance evaluations were neither incentivized nor capable of monitoring problematic employees. And in addition, we found no consensus on how the performance evaluations are used. Although the General Order 205 does include guidance for using the performance evaluation process to coach and counsel employees, this has not translated into practice for all officers within LRPD. Next slide, please. So we also looked, in addition to performance evaluations, at the LRPD promotional process. Now, the LRPD promotional process is governed by the City of Little Rock Civil Service Commission's promotional procedure guidelines. And we found that the promotional process appears to coincide with many national best practices for the promotion of officers to supervisory and command positions. However, there's still several areas that we found in which the process could and should be improved. Of positive note was that the promotion process includes many practices that are intended to achieve objective outcomes. For example, The assessors of the promotional process are required to reside outside the state of Arkansas and must not be current or former LRPD personnel. Candidates within the promotional process also have the opportunity to appeal written test items and other aspects of the promotional process. However, some aspects of the promotional process do increase the likelihood of subjectivity. Also problematic is the promotion guidelines do not mention factors that would make persons ineligible to apply for positions, such as relatively recent sustained findings of misconduct, particularly acts of serious misconduct. Such factors may include or may indicate poor judgment, lack of leadership skills, or the absence of other desired qualities and skills. Next slide, please. So as part of this audit, we also looked at the topics of de-escalation and cultural competency. Our goal was to assess the extent to which these topics are addressed in LRPD trainings and reiterated in LRPD's general orders. Of note is that the audit did not involve us viewing the trainings in practice, so we could not assess the quality of the trainings that the officers received. To assess de-escalation, we reviewed LRPD Academy and in-service training agendas, curriculums, post-training surveys, and general orders. We found that LRPD's attention to and emphasis on de-escalation during in-service and academy training courses increased between 2016 and 2020. This was evident through the addition of new training objectives, such as allow officers to practice de-escalation through scenario-based training, and the inclusion of a new de-escalation decision-making video in the training curriculum that showed an officer from another department failing to intervene in a use of force situation. Lastly, only the 2020 lesson plan explicitly stated that the scenarios are designed to allow for possible de-escalation and decision-making by officers. Now, despite the increased emphasis on de-escalation, some LRPD officers still desire additional training on de-escalation, use of force, and crisis intervention. It's also important to note that LRPD's 2020 in-service training curriculum had to be modified because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So similar to de-escalation, for cultural competency, we reviewed LRPD Academy and in-service training agendas, curriculums, post-training surveys, and general orders. And we found that LRPD's Academy and in-service trainings covered topics directly related to cultural competency. And a list of these topics, which is pretty extensive, is included in the report. However, LRPD does not appear to consistently provide a dedicated block of in-service training specifically on cultural competency and awareness. Consistent with our findings regarding de-escalation training, some LRPD officers also desire additional training on cultural diversity and awareness. Lastly, interviews and focus groups with LRPD personnel revealed that training courses on implicit bias and cultural diversity are not always well received by all officers. Personnel stated that it depends who you ask and that some bias-based training immediately shuts people down. Interviewees stressed that given the subject material, it is important to have a good training instructor who has the ability to connect with officers when teaching the material. Tom, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you, sir. So another section that we looked at was both the city and LRPD's policies on nepotism. And one of our main findings that we had was both the city and the LRPD policy, they could be expanded. For instance, while the city's policy certainly did not sufficiently address all of the potential instances of conflict, the LRPD's policy was a bit more expansive, though it did contain some of the same deficiencies as the city's policy. So one of the things that we talked about was the department's policy focused on familiar relationships and doesn't include non-familial relationships that also might be categorized as cronyism. Additionally, the prohibitions on nepotism were housed within a general order related to transfer and assignment requests, and therefore didn't prohibit nepotism in areas outside of supervision. So what we recommended was that they create a standalone policy related to this. Similarly, for harassment, within the general order, there is room for improvement. We do note that the present general order on harassment acts as a solid framework, but it could be expanded, particularly the definition of harassment, to include that all reasons that an individual might be targeted. For instance, in our report, we stated that a person's weight, a person's speech patterns, or other characteristics might be the reason for the harassment, and that it may not only be racial or sexual harassment. We also identified one of the sections which warned that employees may be disciplined should an be subject to criminal proceedings if their allegations are determined to be non-factual. And so we recommend that this section is removed from the general order. We also note that the policy lacks adequate safeguards against the potential for harassment of complainants. And so we recommended that the department create such specific prohibitions against that harassment. With early intervention systems, I'm not sure how much people who are listening and watching know about early intervention systems. They're gaining a lot of popularity within the policing world. They're designed to identify potential officers or identify officers who are potentially problematic and may have a higher risk for an adverse event. The fact that the LRPD has an EIS is a positive step. However, it's housed in a directive related to administrative investigations and discipline. And the entire concept behind an EIS is that it should be non-disciplinary. So we've recommended that the department remove the guidance from the accountability directive and create a separate policy. We also found that the triggers for an EIS alert are insufficient to actually identify officers who are at risk of an adverse event. Because they are so high, it's likely that you're not going to trigger them, and it's not going to get the number of officers that you really want to be able to capture. For private and confidential information, we found that overall the department does have adequate restrictions. However, these restrictions are spread across multiple directives. And so we recommended that the department create a standalone policy. We also found that the policies don't sufficiently identify preventative measures. So what they did was they identified who could and who could not, access information. But a recommendation from somebody on this committee actually was for the screen guards for people's computer screens. And so we incorporated that into our report as well. And finally, the policy related to access to the record section, we felt was overall strong, though there are some sections that could be revised for greater clarity. And I will hand it over to Ben, who did some work on the body-worn camera review.
Thank you, Tom. So through our review of LRPD's general order governing the use of body-worn cameras, we found that LRPD allows officers to view body-worn camera video recordings for less than lethal force incidents prior to writing a use of force incident report. Now, there is considerable debate within the criminal justice system or criminal justice field as to when others or officers should be able to review video in relation to writing a use of force report. On one hand, some argue that given limitations in recall after a traumatic event, viewing video prior to writing a report will lead to more accurate report. On the other hand, Others argue that force must be justified by facts known to the officer at the time of force rather than an officer's post-event review of the footage. There is merit to both arguments, and there is presently no consensus on the issue. One potential solution, though, that we recommend is for officers to write an initial report without seeing the footage and then write a supplemental report where they can document additional information that officers were either not aware of, perceived differently, or forgot as a result of stress. In reviewing the general order, we also found problems with LRPD's current review process of BWC files. For example, the general order does not describe the criteria for which body-worn camera files will be assessed by lieutenants during monthly reviews. In addition, the monthly video review form that lieutenants use when reviewing footage does not include any compliance criteria for the operation of the body-worn camera equipment. Next slide, please. So in addition to body-worn cameras, we also looked at LRPD's policy governing vehicle pursuits. So vehicle pursuits represent a significant safety concern for both the officer and the subject. We found that the general order does emphasize the due regard for the safety of all persons throughout the policy, which is very important. However, we also found that LRPD's general order permits officers to engage in pursuit driving while a civilian is in the vehicle. Even if someone has signed a waiver of liability, the policy should be clear that civilians participating in a ride-along should not be in a department vehicle during a pursuit. We also found some problems with the dynamics between the pursuing officer and his or her supervisor in the general order. Supervisors are ultimately held responsible for any pursuit that an officer under his or her command engages in. Supervisors have the authority to override an officer's decision to initiate a vehicle pursuit or authorize additional units for the pursuit. Now, their ability, supervisors that is, to make informed decisions is dependent upon regular updates regarding the status of the pursuit and other relevant factors. LRPD's general order requires the first unit in a vehicle pursuit to notify communications of certain information, but does not specify how often the first unit or other units should provide communications with pursuit updates. Real-time information is critical for a supervisor to be able to make an informed decision as to whether a pursuit should continue or terminate. Tom?
Thank you, sir. And we'll go through the last couple of sections that we reviewed. One of them was asset forfeiture. And what we want to recognize from the start is that the Little Rock Police Department does not have the ultimate authority to decide what will or will not be forfeited. That decision is made by the district attorney's office. However, the Little Rock Police Department does play a role at the beginning of the process, and for that we find that some clear direction could be beneficial. For instance, the department doesn't provide an independent standard for assessing whether a particular asset has a direct connection to the criminal activity. And we reference the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Policy Manual, which uses a probable cause standard, as well as Arkansas Code 564-505, which states that that a person must be convicted of a felony offense in order for the property to be seized and forfeited. As a function of transparency, we also recommend that the department memorialize how funds which are generated from asset forfeiture will be used. What in our report we say that it could be that all or a portion of asset forfeiture funds is used for community engagement or outreach, regardless of exactly how it is used. Just being transparent and being able to tell community members how it's being used may remediate some of the community mistrust of the process. And finally, with take-home vehicles, we reviewed the department's policies. We overall found that that General Order 302, it covered a large range of important topics, but could provide some greater structure in exactly how take-home vehicles can be used. As it relates to the use of take-home vehicles as an incentive to living in the city of Little Rock, we believe that this is reasonable. However, we do say that the General Order 302 would need to be revised, and that the determination should be based on the current fleet size, the projected budget, and other city resources. That is the end of our presentation. I do want to say that I know that we just ran through a 104-page report in about 25 minutes. So what we wanted to do was make sure that there was enough time for Q&A. Our report is publicly available. And so that's why we really wanted to be able to leave the time for discussion. And with that, I will say thank you all for your time and attention. And if there's any questions, we are more than willing to answer them now.
Thank you so much, Tom and Ben, for your comments. Everyone, you may use the question and answer section or raise your hand if you have any questions for Tom and Ben at this time. I currently do not see anything in our question and answer section, but again, if you have any questions for Ben or Tom, please put them in the chat, raise your hand, or put them on Facebook. So what I'll do is I'll check, of course, on Facebook because we are live streaming. So I'll check to see if there are any questions in the chat, and I don't see any questions there. So we'll give maybe a couple of seconds or so if anybody wants to ask a question. So I'll ask one, just in case somebody has any interest and they're just thinking about what they want to ask. What was the most compelling piece? I mean, I know you had this huge report, but what was some of the most compelling pieces of information for you as you were going through and gathering the information?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I think for me, and I'll let Ben, I know he had focused on a couple of sections, but I think for me, one of the most important things is really looking at that accountability data. And as we are going through it, we saw this consistent trend of non-white female personnel having these more disparate outcomes. And the department has that data as well. And that's not in any way unique to Little Rock Police Department. One of my roles too is I'm one of the associate monitors on the Chicago consent decree for data management. And I find that departments don't utilize the data that they have, that it's there, that it tells a story, it provides you a pointer. And I think when we talked with the Little Rock Police Department members, there was an understanding that there was something there that they wouldn't have seen, because I don't know if they looked into the data as much as a researcher would. And so I think for me, that was the biggest thing, is there's data there, it can be used, and being able to understand what it's trying to tell you. Ben, if there's anything from the sections that you took, yep.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I certainly agree. I think one of the most important things, as Tom said, was the findings regarding the accountability data and some of the, the findings that he looked at specifically with the disparate outcomes that we viewed from the data. But, another area that I think stood out to me was the performance evaluations aspect, and the fact that, there's a lot of potential there for LRPD to really take advantage of the process that performance evaluations offer in terms of, improving performance, officer performance, really making them an opportunity to help with career advancement and mentoring, which I know are laid out within LRPD's policy. So, and it's a matter of getting it from policy to practice. So there's certainly, a gap right now, but there's potential, and clearly, if policy indicates anything, it's that LRPD wants to take more advantage of the performance evaluation process than they currently are.
Tamika, can I add one other thing? I apologize, but
Sure, go ahead.
another thing was when we talked with the LRPD officers, there was an apparent disconnect between the officers and the sergeants and management. We heard a lot of concern from the officers. During one of our focus groups, one officer kept repeating the phrase, "It depends on who you know. It depends on who you know. It depends on who you are." And I think that a lot of officers felt that same way, that it wasn't an impartial accountability system, and that there was some differences based on who you are. And so again, when you're talking about information that is readily available, either with the data or just going and talking with the officers, I think that information is something that we had found consistently the officers felt that they weren't being listened to.
Good deal. Thank you so much for that. We do have a raised hand, and it is one of our own, Lieutenant Benny Bowers. He has a question for you. Lieutenant Bowers?
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. Tom, my question is, as it relates to an area that is critical for the officers' safety, the community's safety, for the officers to be successful, and that's the de-escalation training. And I understand that you weren't able to witness that training based on a recruit school not being in place, but what would be your recommendations as a follow-up as it relates to assessing the de-escalation training that LRPD has in place?
I will. Ben, did you want to take that? Because I know that you had a big focus on the de-escalation parts.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and you're right in that we weren't able to look, assess the quality of the training since we didn't see it. What we did look at was the amount that de-escalation is really interwoven across, both policy and within the training itself. So, its presence within the academy, its presence within in-service training. And so, we definitely would recommend that, if you're looking to look specifically at the quality of the training, that you do have, somebody outside come in and take a look at the training, because, that certainly the presence of it alone, is not enough, and making sure that the training includes all of the necessary elements of de-escalation and is consistent with, the 21st century policing principles is critical. So, Tom, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
One other thing, and we didn't take a look at this specifically in Little Rock, but I know that it's an issue in other departments. There's de-escalation skills, and then there's the utilization of them on the street. So I'll give you an example. A de-escalation skill is providing clear direction with an outcome. But somebody might say, "I told the person, get on the ground or you will be hurt." That's clear direction. That is providing an outcome. However, I wouldn't necessarily categorize that as de-escalation. And so it's not only teaching these skills, but it's an honest assessment on the street. Did we attempt to de-escalate that person? And, de-escalation, it's a lot of active listening skills. But like I said, you can meet the definition of de-escalation without actually meeting what de-escalation is. And so one of the biggest things that I always tell people is be honest if it was de-escalation or was it not. And I go back to the data piece because I'm a data nerd, and are we capturing de-escalation? Are we getting a good picture of when de-escalation is occurring? And so that's just something I always recommend to departments, is be honest as to whether you actually are using de-escalation.
Good deal. And thank you so much, Lieutenant Bowers, for your question, and Ben and Tom for your feedback. We don't see any more questions in the chat or the question and answer section or on Facebook, so that we don't linger any longer. Again, thank you so much for your feedback, and we'll go ahead and end this session. But before we do, I do want to make sure that that this presentation, you also did this at the board meeting not too long ago. And during that board meeting, the mayor asked the chief of police to appoint a committee within the police department to work on implementing the recommendations. And that work is underway. What we wanted to do as members of the independent review committee was to give community members an opportunity to hear feedback firsthand, so that they could ask any questions just in case they did not attend that board meeting. But again, you all have been great in presenting the findings. Thank you so much for working with the IRC. Thanks so much to Kendra and James for their support of the committee, for making sure that this community meeting went on and was done in the best way possible. And again, hats off to our mayor, Mayor Frank Scott Jr., for making sure that we have this committee to examine these findings and also to follow up the work in appointing a committee to make sure that these recommendations, that actions are taken on these recommendations. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. We're so happy that you were with us, and this will stay posted on the City of Little Rock's Facebook page. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can place them there, and I'm certain someone will follow up with you. Again, thank you all so much for being here, for tuning in, and that's all we have for this evening. Take care.
Thank you all.
All right.